Hello everybody and welcome to this video with myself and Gavin, and we just actually wanted to talk about something that comes up a lot, we get asked a lot about, is closed hole and open hole, what the difference is, and there's obviously a physical difference, but maybe I just wanted to lean on Gavin as a professional flute player and ask him his thoughts in terms of how often it comes up, and he's been through the whole education system and everything else. So if we just start out, Gavin, the closed hole system is where you have obviously all the holes covered, and if you've been using a student flute, you would be fully used to that. And a lot of people, well, in England, we start people on closed hole. That's not true everywhere in the world.
Yeah, true.
But you started on the closed hole,
Yes.
presumably.
Yeah. My first 2 or 3 flutes were closed hole, and I only actually swapped onto open hole on the flute that I still play on now, and made that transition while I was at college. Some people do that earlier. It sort of depends on your teachers and their philosophy, and also where you're going with your flute playing a little bit as well. Yeah.
So from a technical standpoint, the open hole is obviously as it sounds. There are open holes here, a bit like a polo mint, for want of a nicer explanation. But there is a reason for that, and this is why Gavin's here, because we just wanted him to maybe demonstrate some of that. So actually, maybe we should swap flutes, Gav, because what are some of the technical things that you might appreciate as a pro player or someone playing maybe advanced repertoire with an open hole?
Yeah. Well, I mean, just from the basics to start with, in terms of the way it feels as you produce the sound on the instrument, there is something about the resonance of the instrument which changes from a closed hole to an open hole. And many people have tried to sort of quantify it and define it and everything, and everybody seems to have slightly different opinions, whether it's to do with the fact that you've got a slightly larger chamber because of the finger closing the hole, who knows, but that could be part of it. But there's definitely a difference in the resonance. In terms of sort of technique, you can obviously do quarter tone things you can sort of try and do. So for some of the contemporary repertoire, that opens that up to you. Also, just for sort of, again, some of the repertoire requires sort of sliding between notes, so you can smear the sound a bit more.
So sort of scoops, bends,
yeah. And if you're going into sort of the jazz flute world, dare I say the Ron Burgundy world, you can sort of
he's on later.
Yeah, you can again use that to good effect to sort of give a slightly sort of different sound to the flute, and so it's not such a classical sound, which is obviously what you'd be looking for, a more sort of laid back sound, if you like. And so in doing that, you can then sort of, you use the sort of a lazier fingering sort of technique to achieve a slightly different tone. Yeah.
Can you give us a couple of even exaggerated examples of that, for maybe just a slide?
Yeah, I mean, just a slide, sort of a classic one would be sort of starting on a G. So again, I've just taken the finger off there so you can hear the difference between an E. If I slide the finger straight off the hole. So you can hear it doesn't actually want to sort of sound as a note anymore. So there's a sort of, in terms of fine tuning it, you have to sort of find for sort of contemporary techniques where that position is best. But obviously if you're moving in terms of trying to play something as sort of fast moving, and you can probably barely hear that, but if you slow it down, you'll hear that there's a slight bend in the sound as you sort of play up and down. Yeah. So
cool. Well, from a practical point of view, it does take a bit of getting used to, and that's something that we see in the shop, especially if you've never played an open hole. And actually, it can suddenly feel like the flute's harder to play because essentially your fingers aren't quite covering the hole as they should. And maybe, do you think it helps with posture a little bit and positioning a little bit? It forces you to be more precise?
Yeah, definitely. It makes you sort of actually be much more aware of your hand position and finger position over the keys. And there's another argument which is sort of put out there, which is actually that the right hand should be closed and the left hand should be open. Some people say that would be the ideal flute in terms of resonance and sound, but that's another discussion. But
well, yeah, that's another one for another day.
But in terms of actually getting the hand position technique, spot on, it does make you really focus on that. And quite often people have a sort of a lazy third finger, which tends to be sort of further back on the key.
Down on the D.
Yeah. So obviously with that, you've got to make sure that that's centred over there. Otherwise, none of the lower notes are going to work, and your D's not going to sound properly, and you're going to split notes like I demonstrated with the E. So it is a question of actually being aware of the open holes as opposed to just the the ease of a closed hole flute.
Yeah, and there are little plugs that you can get called open hole plugs, which some people use in the transition period, and they just pop in and they cover the holes, and you can get silver or rubber, and so a lot of people use them as they cross over.
I mean, I use that, and generally what you do is you start with, if you need to, you start with all of the plugs in, and then just work your way through. So you take one out at a time. Depending on which way you want to go, take the D1 out, then the G1 out, and gradually work your way up. And sometimes it's one a day, or it can be half a week of getting used to that, and then another half a week with that, depending on your practice routine.
So it depends how much practice you are or aren't doing.
Yeah.
But it's worth pointing out that there are professional players using closed hole flutes. So it's not necessarily something you have to have. It's something you've got to test and feel. And
I mean, out and out professional classical flute players do occasionally have closed hole flutes that they'll use for concerts. Obviously, if you go into the sort of the doubling world as well, then closed hole flutes are much easier for a clarinet or a sax player to swap across to. Because as a flute player, it's sort of easier in a way to swap the other way because you're used to that. But again, I know a lot of guys who are flute players who occasionally in a pit situation will use a closed hole flute just because it's easy when you're doing quick changes between instruments. Yeah,
you're not going to find your fingers.
Yeah.
So most upgrade model flutes come with an option to have closed or open. And so if you do manage to come in and try some flutes, if you're upgrading, just ask us in the shop and we can get those out. We can show you, we can use some of the plugs and see how you get on. Yeah. Cool. Okay, well, that's the difference between open hole and closed hole flutes.